For those of you out in the Ethernet watching this on Zoom or something, you never can tell what might happen when you're renting a facility. You never tell what backgrounds. I don't know what this is all about. I really have no clue. But when you're renting a facility from someone else, you never can tell. We were in Haverhill, Massachusetts for a while, and we rented a room from the YWCA, and in our midweek services, we had a background of belly dancing music from across the hall. So while we were studying the scriptures, other people were, with the cymbals and that sort of thing. You don't know. And so we're anxious to get into our new building and maybe not have quite so many surprises. But it's kind of interesting, and if it keeps your attention, that's great too. This morning, I'd like to look at wrestling with God. I picked a scripture that's kind of puzzling. It's in Genesis chapter 32, where Jacob wrestles with a man who turns out to be a manifestation of God. Did you ever wrestle with God? Why do we wrestle with God? Why have you wrestled with God, if you've wrestled with God? You don't have to go into details, but in general, why do people wrestle with God? Yeah.
Sometimes it's hard to come to terms with what he wants versus what I want.
Yes. Sometimes it is very hard to come to terms with the difference between what God wants and what we want. I mean, we can see that in Gethsemane. I mean, Jesus in the flesh, as a man, his flesh is saying, I don't want to go. And yet he knows what God wants, and he's wrestling with God in prayer, pleading, God, is there another way to go through this? His flesh is saying no, but his spirit is saying yes, and he's wrestling with God about it. And ultimately, he surrenders to God and goes on with what he knows to do. And that's really a pattern for all of us, isn't it? We're told that unless we deny ourselves and pick up our cross and follow him, we can't be his disciples. And our world is telling us, if you're not following your flesh, if you're not following your heart, you're not being honest to yourself. Who you really are is what your heart desires and what your body wants. And so we're letting our bodies dominate. Our fleshly desires dominate. This is what the world is saying, and you're not being honest about that. But really what God is saying and what we're designed to be is our spirit is supposed to be controlling our body, and God's spirit is supposed to be controlling our spirit. And so we're going to wrestle with God because of this conflict. A very good point. Sometimes, I can mention with myself, sometimes we know what we want to do, but we're wrestling because we're afraid. And I think this is maybe part of what's going on with Jacob. This was a long time ago, and I wasn't a real hero. I was 3 months old in Christ, and I had a job at a job with the New York State Education Department, and I was a key punch operator, and entering data. And we had a new supervisor, and the new supervisor was kind of a goof off. He had some friends, and they were into drugs and other stuff. And he was bragging about how Halloween was coming up in 2 days and that they were going to have a party. This was the second shift. See, when the supervisor was there, the other people weren't, the other people in charge. And he was going to be bringing all kinds of drugs and booze and stuff, and he was all happy and bragging about it. And I was a new Christian. I said, well, how are we going to do with this, And I said, hey, look, this is wrong. This is not legal. If I see drugs here at a work party, I'm calling the police. And he says, you think you're going to call the police, I'm going to stop you. Back then there weren't any cell phones, It wasn't like I could, sneak off to the hallway somewhere and call the police quietly. He was talking about like a wrestling match or a fist fight over the landline on his desk. And I wasn't really planning on that either. And I was shaking in my boots. But I knew what direction I needed to take, but it was not enough time, to get the Charles Atlas weightlifting program in process or anything like that. And I said, look, I have to do what I have to do. I don't know what you're going to do, but I know what I have to do. It sounded all courageous, but on the inside I was shaking like a leaf. And you better believe that for the next day or so, I was wrestling with God about what was going to happen when that party was supposed to happen. And having wrestled with God, God heard me, and he rescued me from my fears. I came into work, whether it was that morning or the morning after, and all of a sudden the supervisor was gone and about half a dozen other people were gone. And apparently, somebody in the office had overheard the conversation I had with the supervisor and had informed the higher up people what was going on. And of course, they couldn't prove anything about drugs and alcohol at the workplace, but they could look at the productivity of the people as soon as that new supervisor came. And so, boink, the productivity went down. They had the excuse to fire him, and they also had the excuse to fire anybody else who was joining in with him in the partying because their productivity went down so drastically. Obviously, they must have been involved in this stuff. And so they were canned, and I wasn't facing certain annihilation with the fisticuffs. And boy, was I relieved. Boy, was I relieved. I think there's a similarity. My case was like a tiny little mirror of what Jacob was going through in Genesis 32. There was another aspect of it. I don't know. Maybe you can have other incidents that you have faced. Fears, things like that. I know when preaching, many times I've wrestled with God for a long time, overnight, for days sometimes, just to deliver me from the frustration and the resentments and a growing bitterness I was feeling on the inside because things weren't going the way I wanted them to and the way I thought God wanted them to. But you're dealing with people. And folks don't always do what you want them to do, and they don't, And it was my own bad attitudes, but I had to wrestle with God to be healed from it and forgiven from it and to break through. And time and again, I would have to do that. So it isn't just, I'm going to be a great conquering hero, but it was also, I'm failing at this thing, and it's because of my own sinful nature, and I need help. And I think that's part of what's going to go on with Jacob here in our passage. You think of any other reasons that you might want to wrestle with God? One is the idea of dealing with our sin, or wanting forgiveness and wanting a change. Some of it is dealing with our fears. Some of it's needing the courage to do what we know, what we want to do. Other things.
Today, the peer pressure on teenagers and kids is so much different than when we grew
Yes.
up. Are you going to do these drugs? Are you getting tattooed? It's just questions, It's hard for kids to stand up against that.
Yes, it is.
So I feel that we need to instill our thoughts and beliefs in them as best we can. Maybe equip them.
Yes. And that's something for us to wrestle with God in prayer about. And it's also something for our kids to wrestle with God about, because they're the ones that are in the battlefield. And we need to be preparing our kids for that kind of a struggle. What do you do? How do you deal with saying no to somebody who's trying to force you to do what's wrong? How do you stand up to that? That kind of thing. What you remember? Brian talked about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they wrestled with God about the interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's dream in the beginning. They must have wrestled with God about whether they were going to bow down and worship, and how they're going to be thrown into the furnace of fire. We need to come, get our hands onto God and not let him go unless you bless us, All too often we hunger and thirst for righteousness for other people. I'm hungering and thirsting that you be righteous, when really I need to be hungering and thirsting that I remain righteous, or I be righteous, and to cling to God that way. Let's look at our passage. Actually, there's a bunch of passages. I'll read the passage and then let you see how puzzling it is, and then we'll do the background, and maybe the pieces will come together. I'll do it that way. In Genesis chapter 32, starting in verse 24, Jacob was left. I'm going to leave the context out, and then I'll fill it in. And so this will all be confusing, but then we'll go back and look at the context, and then the pieces will start to come together. Then Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When he saw that he had not prevailed against him, he touched the socket of his thigh. So the socket of Jacob's thigh was dislocated while he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the dawn is breaking." But he said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." So he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." And he said, "Your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel. For you have striven with God and with men, and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him and said, "Please tell me your name." But he said, Why is it that you ask my name?" And he blessed him there. So Jacob named the place Peniel, for he said, "I have seen God face to face, yet my life was preserved." Now the sun arose upon him just as he crossed over Peniel, and he was limping on his thigh. Therefore, to this day, the sons of Israel do not eat the sinew of the hip, which is on the socket of the thigh, because he touched the socket of Jacob's thigh in the sinew of the hip. Now, that was the fight. That was a fight and a striving with God. We know it's a striving with God because that's what Jacob realized in verse 30. He saw God face to face, and his life was preserved. He realized that the person he was wrestling with was a manifestation of God, and he must have realized that because he was begging God for a blessing. "I'm not going to let you go until you bless me." But what was all of this about? Well, this goes way back into Jacob's history and the situation that Jacob was facing at this time. Earlier in Jacob's life, more than 20 years before that, I don't know exactly how long it was. When Jacob got his name, he got his name because he came out of the womb. He was one of twins, okay? And he came out of the womb with his hand on his brother's heel. And he was named Jacob, which meant heel grabber. And the idea of heel grabber was also the idea of usurper or cheater. And that was his name. And he sort of lived up to his name in a way. When he grew up, his brother Esau was out hunting, and he came back famished. And he was really starving, and his older son, because he was the older brother, had the right to the lion's share of the inheritance. That was the way they did things, right? And so in Genesis chapter 25, let's see. verse 29 and to 34. When Jacob had cooked stew, Esau came in from the field, and he was famished. And Esau said to Jacob, "Please let me have a swallow of that red stuff there, for I'm famished." Therefore his name was called Edom. That's the idea of red. But Jacob said, "First, sell me your birthright." And Esau said, "Behold, I'm about to die, so what use then is this birthright to me?" And Jacob said, "First swear to me." So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. And then Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew, and he ate and drank and rose and went on his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. Now the Bible specifically, criticizes Esau because he didn't value his birthright any more than a bowl of soup. And that was a valid criticism because it was worth so much more, and he was willing to kiss it goodbye for a swallow of food. Esau was sort of an earthly-minded person, and the desires of the flesh were predominant for him, and he did. But what about Esau? What about Jacob? I mean, you talk about price gouging, right? I mean, really, a whole birthright for a bowl of stew, and he got away with it. But it fit his name, didn't it? And then what happened later on, when his father was getting old and hard of seeing, I won't read this part, but I'll just retell the story. When the father was old and hard of seeing, was difficulty seeing, and it was time for Isaac to give a blessing to his eldest son, a blessing from God, his mother, Rebekah, Jacob's mother, Rebekah, got the idea of, okay, while Esau is out hunting game for his father, I'll make the same dish out of a goat, and you pretend to be Esau and get the blessing instead. And so his mom was sort of conniving too, and Jacob went along with it, with the deceit. He put some hairy goat skin on the back of his neck, so when his father felt him, he'd think it was Esau, who was a hairy person, and he was rather clean, not clean shaven, but didn't have as much hair. And he tried to disguise himself as his brother, and he stole his father's blessing from his father. And after his father found out, it was too late. Isaac realized that, hey, the blessing has gone out. It's gone to Jacob instead of Esau, and it isn't going to be changed. And Esau was begging, can't you take it back? Can't you give me something? And Isaac said, no, God has already determined it. And he did. All the way back when the boys were born, it was predicted by God's Spirit through Rebekah that the younger son would be served by the older son. But it was obtained by cheating. And so what happens? Jacob was a cheater. His mother instigated it, but he went along with it. And Esau, he was mad. And he was muttering to himself. He's saying, well, when my father dies, I'm just going to kill my brother, and then that'll take care of the whole business. I'll have the inheritance and the blessing. And he's comforting himself by the thought of getting rid of his brother. And because one of the servants overheard Esau muttering to himself, his mother sent Jacob away. So you go to my family's house. You go under the pretext of finding a wife of our family stock, and we'll wait. I'll send you word when Esau's anger has cooled off. Well, Esau's anger we don't know about Esau's anger after that. Nothing's said. And Jacob has a time of it. He's cheated by his uncle. He worked 7 years to marry Rachel, but then at the very last minute of the wedding night, they switched women on him, and it was Leah instead of Rachel. Oh, well, it's not against the custom of our times to marry a younger girl before her sister. You can have the other one too, but you got to work another 7 years. And he worked another 7 years. And then he was going to work for livestock. And well, his wages would be the spotted ones or the striped ones. And his uncle kept changing his wages because things were going the wrong way as far as where the wealth was going. And so here was Jacob being cheated, but also trying to cheat his father-in-law back. I don't know if you ever heard this. There's sort of an old wives' tale, or was going around a long time ago. It was an old wives' tale when I was young, so I don't know. But if a pregnant woman or a woman who was becoming pregnant had seen something like a strawberry or something peculiar, that when this child was conceived, something about that would transfer to the child. Your child had this strawberry birthmark because you were eating strawberries the night you were conceived, and stuff like that. I don't know if you ever heard that kind of thing being said. I did when I was really young. Evidently, Jacob believed something like that because he took all of these branches and he would make the branches look like the kind of sheep that he wanted to be born. So if he needed a striped sheep, he would have striped branches. And if he wanted spotted sheep, he'd have spotted branches. And he'd do this trying to, increase his wages. So his father-in-law was changing the wages all of the time, trying to cheat him. He was trying to cheat his father-in-law by doing all of this kind of stuff. And in the meantime, God was just blessing him and increasing his wealth and increasing his wealth. 20 years passed since his brother had planned on killing him. And things were not going too well with his father-in-law. And essentially God said, okay, it's time for you to go back. Go back. My brother was going to kill me. Well, you tell me to go back. Things aren't that great here. I'm going to go back. And so he does. He has some adventures on the way. He has some insurance from God because he sees an army of God on the way, angels. And so, well, maybe God's going to be with me. And here he is on the verge of going back into Canaan land. He sends messengers out to his brother Esau saying, I've come back, I have plenty of stuff, I've come to be reconciled with you and come to meet you and ask that we meet peacefully. And the messenger comes back and he said, well, Esau's coming to meet you all right. And he's got, what was it? I forget now, is it 400 or 500 soldiers with him? 500 armed men. What would you think? The last you heard about your brother was that he was planning on killing you. And the first thing you hear about going back is that there's this army coming and your brother's at the head of it. And he's going to meet you. Right? I was just going to deal with the supervisor who wanted to sneak some drugs into the room, but he's dealing with an army, right? What are you going to do? Well, he was smart. He was smart. All right, I'm dividing my whole wealth into groups, so if one is attacked, the other might survive. I'm dividing my family into groups, so I can spare some of them anyway. And then I'm going to send out gifts. And so he had a big flock of sheep that he was going to send out. And the messengers are saying, this is a gift from your servant, Jacob. And then another flock of goats. And then another group of camels and cattle. Gift after gift after gift. It's a gift. It's a gift. So please don't hurt me, I mean, it was wise. Trying to placate his brother. Okay, I cheated you out of your inheritance, but, I'm going to make up for it. That's sort of the idea. And then he sends his wives and children over, and he's all alone on the other side of this river that he has to cross to get there. And it's at this point he meets this guy that he wrestles with. So what do you think? You think maybe Jacob was afraid? That he maybe, I really need your help. You told me to come. You wanted me to come. It was your idea. But I'm going to meet an army of 500 people, and I don't have my own army. And this is, this is where he was. He was obeying God, he knew, but he knew also in his heart and, viscerally, this is scary. And there was this guy coming up, and who was this guy? Was he a spy sent from his brother? I don't know how this fight started. I don't know who started it. I don't know what they said to each other, but they wrestled. And somewhere along the line, and we don't know exactly when, but somewhere along the line, Jacob figured out the guy he was wrestling was not an enemy, but was actually God. Somewhere. I kind of think at least one of the major breaking points here was when the guy he was wrestling with just touched his hip, and his hip was thrown out of joint. Jackie Chan can't do something like that, or any one of these martial artists. They don't just touch somebody and make their hip go out of joint. They'd have to do something major to make that happen. But this guy miraculously causes his hip to go out. Oh, this one I'm wrestling with, he's got some power. And he was cagey about giving him his name, and he sort of figured out he was wrestling with a manifestation of God along the way. And that was the reason, I believe, that that he said in verse 26, I will not let you go unless you bless me. He knew who he was wrestling at that point. And he said, I need your blessing. I can't do without it, and I'm not letting you go. And, you'll have to kill me to get my hands off of your leg or whatever I was grabbing to try to hold on to you, but I need your blessing. You talk about hungry and thirsting for righteousness. That's that kind of thing. I need to be right with you. I need to be right with God. I need to have God's blessing. And he was at that point in his heart and in his soul. And God did bless him. And the really ironic part was that Jacob crossed the river to encounter this army with a dislocated hip, even in worse shape to lead a counterattack or defend his family or anything else. From a physical standpoint, he was even weaker than he would have been if he didn't wrestle with this manifestation of God. But was he weaker? No. Because he had God's blessing. And God did this little shift, sort of like he did with me years ago in the office with that office party. All of a sudden, the trouble was evaporated. And Jacob didn't do anything except graciously accept the welcoming arms of his brother Esau. And they embraced one another, and they cried over one another, and they were friends. And so who gets the credit for taking care of the reconciliation? It was God, right? And isn't that the way it works, really? All so often we try to provide our own solutions to our own fears. And really what we have to do is wrestle with God about it and then surrender to him. Mm-hmm.
You know, God was at work for the 20 years with Esau too.
Yes.
The Bible says that he had been blessed and had more wealth. It would really be, I wish that we could read the story of Esau during that 20 years.
Yes.
You know what happened to Jacob. I'd love to see how God worked through Esau at the same time, so that when they came together, the whole thing came together perfectly at the end.
And you know, God knew all of those things that Jacob did not know. Well, this is along the line with what Rex was talking about this morning. You just don't know all of the reasons behind all of the things that happened. And Jacob didn't know the reason why he had to worry so much when he really didn't have to worry so much, you know. But God did. He's pulling all of the strings. Very good. And you find out at the reconciliation that Esau was saying, hey, I've got all that I need. I really don't need all of your gifts. Now, Jacob insisted that he take them anyway. But it was by the time Jacob had come back, Esau had acquired wealth of his own, independence of his father's wealth, and he was starting his whole country, the Edomites. And so he didn't really need the stuff that he was all jealous about earlier. But of course, Jacob didn't know about that. But he did know he needed God's blessing. And I think that's our major lesson here from Jacob. Not that we're going to wrestle with a stranger sometime. We're going to wrestle with somebody we know and we pray to all of the time. But we have to make sure our prayers have some suction to them. You know? Yes.
I think it was Jacob was just so desperate because he thought he was going to die. If he met his brother, he was going to die. And it reminds me of a sermon that Rex did about desperate prayer.
Yes.
And how when you're back against the wall and you pray so hard for whatever it is.
Yes.
And he was just so desperate. So when he actually wrestled, when he figured out he was a person of God, he was like, fight or flight came in. Because it was like, he was actually literally fighting for his life. He wanted to be blessed.
Yeah.
So he didn't die when he was struck. So it was just one of those desperate situations you get into, and you don't have nowhere else to go but to God.
Yes. I think that's a very good point. He was a desperate man. He knew his life was on the line, and there are no atheists in foxholes, and he wasn't really a recent convert. It wasn't like he became faithful at that moment. I mean, he trusted in God. He decided to go back at God's say-so. So he was acting on faith, but he was still afraid. One more thing that I didn't mention, I think we should. We got about 6 minutes. The name change. I think that's a significant thing in that his name meant cheater or usurper. And up to that point in his life, he was doing the manipulations. He was in control of things. Yes, he was submitting to God. Yes, he believed in God. He asked God for things. He trusted in God. But yet, there was a level of control that he had. He was going to control his wages. He was going to control who got the blessing. He was going to pull the strings to make things happen, right? And he was even pulling the strings trying to placate his brother by all of those gifts. And in this struggle, in the center of this struggle, God told him, got him to say his name. He's saying, yes, I am Jacob, I'm the cheater. And he changed his name. He said, no, it's not going to be this way anymore. You're Israel now. You're a man who's striven with God and prevailed. And you're starting a new life. And you're relying on me rather than your own shrewdness. And so here was this guy who was always relying on himself, and the rest of his life, he was limping. And he was reminded that the strength that he had and the blessings that he had really could no longer come from his own shrewdness and his own effort, but it had to come from God. And in a sense, this sort of fits what Paul has to say in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. People were criticizing Paul for being such a weak and unimpressive person and all this kind of stuff. And he was saying all of this troubles that he'd been through. In 1 Corinthians 12 in verse 10, verse 9 and 10, he was praying to God that this affliction might be delivered from him, this thorn in the flesh. And God told Paul concerning about removing this affliction in the flesh, God said to him, "My grace is sufficient for you, for power is perfected in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, I will boast about my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Therefore, I am well content with weaknesses, with insults, with distresses, with persecutions, with difficulties, for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong." And I think that was sort of a lesson that God was teaching Jacob as well. I think it's a little more obscure, but I think that's part of it. He no longer was Jacob, the shyster, the guy who was going to, do the price gouging and the manipulating. But he was a guy who just knew that he had to rely on God, and that he was weak, and unless I have your blessing, I'm not letting you go. And that's, I think, something for us to emulate. Maybe we won't have to get into a big wrestling match with somebody late at night because of that, but grab onto them and be changed. Other comments or questions? We have just a couple of minutes, and we'll have to adjourn. Brendan?
I think we wrestle with God every day.
Yeah.
We win some battles, we lose some battles.
Yes.
And sometimes we see people losing a lot of battles, which is really, we need to become the Lord to help each other win the battles.
Yeah.
And encourage each other, because we're all in a battle.
That's a good.
Every day.
That is a good point. We are struggling, and most of the time when we're struggling with God, we're struggling against ourselves. It's our fleshly selves that are shrinking back. As we mentioned at the very beginning, we may be shrinking back from what we know we should be doing or should be thinking or how we should act. Or maybe we don't even realize it yet, and we're banging our heads. It's sort of like Saul before he became Paul. He was going the wrong direction, and it was hard to kick against the goats, but he didn't know exactly why until, boink, God gave him a dummy slap on the road to Damascus. But we need to have that kind of wrestling going on. We need to help one another to see clearly when we are wrestling with God. We can pray for one another and be with one another. It's a very good point. Thank you very much. Next week, Brian will be back, and he'll be better at leading discussion than I am, but I hope you benefited. Thank you very much.